This is an audio review of Chapter 7, Crime and the Law, for Introduction to Sociology. So, deviance is a violation of established contextual, cultural, or social norms, whether they be folkways, mores, or codified law. So it can be as minor as a folkway, like picking your nose in public, right? Or as major as violating something that's been codified into law, like committing a murder. So deviance is a term that has negative connotations to it, but for sociologists, we recognize that because something's considered deviant, that doesn't mean it's actually bad, right? There's actually something that we call positive deviance. So, for instance, if you think of the case of Rosa Parks, right, who refused to give up her seat and sparked off the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycotts, right? Or actually, Claudette Colvin. Few people know the story of Claudette Colvin. When she was 15, she refused to move to the back of the bus and give up her seat to a white person 9 months before Rosa Parks did the very same thing. In the same city, in the same bus system, with very tough consequences, she was hauled off the bus, handcuffed, jailed, and nobody really knew about it. So, she's also important because she was one of the plaintiffs in a court case that successfully overturned bus segregation laws in Alabama. So why is she not known as much as Rosa Parks? Well, when she was interviewed herself, she said that the NAACP and other black organizations at the time felt that Rosa Parks would be a good icon because she was an adult, and they didn't think that teenagers would be reliable. But what it really ended up being was that after Colvin was arrested, she, went through a lot of stuff because she was shunned by people in the community for being arrested, for not getting up from her seat on that bus. And as a result, she had a lot of stuff going on, and then she ended up getting pregnant as a teenager. So civil rights leaders didn't think that she was an appropriate symbol for the movement versus Rosa Parks, who was the secretary of the NAACP and was well known and respected, and as Claudette Colvin put it, had the right hair, had the right skin, meaning she was someone that could appeal more to middle-class white Americans. Because this was, of course, during the civil rights era, it was important to galvanize support, or at least that was the perspective of many of these civil rights organizations, was to try to kind of win the hearts and minds of larger white America. And so they picked her because, again, if you pick a teenager who then becomes pregnant, it's easy to say, well, that's why she broke the law, because she's just a teenager, and teenagers are, notoriously not well behaved, right? Versus the way we hear this narrative of Rosa Parks was, she's this hardworking woman, she's just tired, she didn't want to get up from her seat, and she sparked off this whole thing. But really, that was much more of a constructed act by the NAACP and other organizations to kind of create this narrative that really was very effective, right? But anyway, I just find that that was a long-winded side note to say that sometimes doing things that are considered deviant, like staying in your seat when you're supposed to get up from your seat, can actually be what we call positive deviance, right? So it can be something that later on we look back and say, wow, that was really heroic, and not, oh, that person was just breaking the law. So sometimes the laws aren't just. Sometimes the laws, because they're a reflection of our culture, and our culture has a lot of prejudices in them, they can themselves be prejudiced, as we can look back in history and see many, many examples of that, right? So coming back to deviance, this is what makes it complicated. Whether or not something's right or wrong isn't really a measure of, that's kind of irrelevant. What is relevant is how we define it, how we understand it in society. So whether an act is labeled as deviant depends on many factors, such as the location it's done in, the audience, and who the individual is that's committing the act of deviance. So we've discussed norms vary across culture and time. And since deviance is a violation of norms, deviance changes as well. So we'll talk about different sociological theories and how they look at deviance, but the key takeaway is that, when you look with a sociological approach to deviance, is that whether an act is deviant or not just depends on society's response to that act. So the book example explores the idea of driving a hearse as your day-to-day car, right? So driving a hearse is outside of conventional norms, it's a mild form of deviance that can actually become a mark of distinction. So they argue in the book that a conformist would see someone driving around in a hearse and be like, what a weirdo. And a nonconformist would be like, hey, weirdo, that's cool. Right? So deviance is often viewed as a violation of norms, but deviance is not always negative. It is, though, related to social control. So what happens when we violate a social norm? All societies practice some sort of social control or the regulation and enforcement of norms. The goal of social control is to maintain social order, which is an arrangement of practices and behaviors on which people in society base their daily lives. So the book example of this distinction of social order is an employee handbook, and social control is the manager, right, that enforces that employee handbook. So the way that rules are enforced is known as sanctions. Sanctions can be positive and negative, right? To further complicate the issue, they can be positive or negative. So positive sanctions are rewards that are given for conforming. So like, let's say you work really hard at work, you get a promotion, you conformed, here's a positive sanction, right? While negative sanctions are punishments for violating norms. Like, you get bad grades in school, your parents ground you, right? That kind of thing. So just think of it as positive sanctions are rewards that you get for being, conforming to societal notions of, norms. And negative sanctions are punishments you get for violating those norms. So they can be positive or negative, but they can also be informal and formal. Informal sanctions are those that occur in face-to-face interactions, while formal sanctions are ones that are recognized and enforced. So for example, if you get in trouble, let's say with the law, it's actually a really interesting thing we talk about in my crim class, is that sometimes informal sanctions can be more detrimental to some folks than formal sanctions, meaning some people are less worried about being arrested, the formal sanction, as they are about having to call their parents or their mom and say, hey, come pick me up from jail, which would be the informal sanction of how she's going to treat you after. So, there's kind of those informal sanctions that we get just from those people around us in all of our interactions. But the formal ones often come from the state or other kind of sanctioned operators of that social control. Okay, so let's jump into different theoretical perspectives on deviance. So first up is functionalism. So functionalists are interested in how different parts of society contribute to a whole, right? So think of it like pieces of a puzzle that fit together to create a whole. So each institution in society is like a different puzzle piece. So they view deviance as a key component for a functioning society. So we're going to go through a few of these theories under the banner of functionalism that all explore deviance, specifically strain theory, social disorganization theory, and cultural deviance theory. So first up, Durkheim's essential nature of deviance. So Durkheim sees deviance as a necessary part of society because when deviance is challenged, it can change people's views, such as the positive deviance examples like the Rosa Parks Claudette Colvin example or other civil rights movement activists, that sometimes breaking a law, challenging an established norm can actually change the way we look at those things or even change the laws themselves. But also when deviance is punished, in a different way can bring us together, as Durkheim says, that when you punish people for being deviant, it can reaffirm culturally held social norms. So for example, you see someone ditch class in high school, they get a detention that reminds other students you're not supposed to ditch, right? So it's kind of funny for me. The way I think of this one is having an older sibling. I have an older brother. And with my parents, there was kind of these things of, oftentimes children test the boundaries of their parents of where those lines are, right? And so for myself, because my brother crossed some of those boundaries, I knew where those lines were. Versus if you're the oldest kid and you're kind of challenging that power, that social control of your parents' authority when you're, a kid or a teenager, then you kind of know when you come up against those boundaries. So basically Durkheim's saying, once you cross the line on something, that's how you know where the line is, right? Okay, so moving on briefly to Merton's strain theory. Now again, take my crim class, we'll talk about all this stuff way more in depth. And here we're just kind of scratching the surface of this stuff. So I put this little graphic in here to try to illustrate some of this stuff, but I will do my best to keep it brief because I'm not usually great at that. Okay, so generally, Merton's strain theory says that there's goals in society that people want to achieve, but they can't always reach those goals. And that causes a strain or stress that people are aware of the goals, but they don't have the means to achieve them. So structural strain theory, or just called strain theory sometimes, acknowledges that society considers some goals acceptable. So think about what those goals might be. I mean, hint, if we were in a classroom, I'd make you answer this. We're not, right? We're online. So I'll just kind of fill in that blank for you. Basically, if you think about the goal of society and the means in which you're supposed to get those goals. So think for a moment, what's kind of the goal in our super capitalistic society? It's cash money, right? It's nice car, big house, family, good job, money, 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 right? Or that kind of American dream ideology stuff, right? Success means kind of capital in a capitalistic society, right? So when you think about the institutionalized means, right? So if the goals of society are cash money, what are the means by which you're supposed to get cash money? Typically that's by getting a good job, getting a college degree to be able to get a good job, et cetera, like you're kind of doing it right now, right? So the idea is for those who accept the cultural goals, right, cash money, and use those accepted means to get it, those are this kind of conformist group. So basically, we'll go through how this kind of works because I feel like sometimes people oversimplify the idea of accept and reject. It's not necessarily as if they reject, it's more that they can't reach it for whatever reason, right? So for example, the conformists are the people, they work hard, they go to school, they go to, they get their college degree, they get a good job, they save their money, they get that, American dream, which is just a bunch of crap, right? Nice clothes, a retirement plan, all that kind of crap, right? So the ritualists, though, are people who basically, for instance, I think my parents are a great example of this, that they worked really hard their whole lives, but they never really made it to that place of cash money, American dream, right? So part of this involves, did they reject that? It's no, my dad's one of those people that plays the lottery all the time and has every penny spent. So I'm sure he'd love cash money. But the idea is that they weren't really able to achieve that based on, where they were at. So ritualism means that they still live their lives day to day. They go to work, they have their steady job, they might not have the same kind of career opportunities or abilities to move up, but they keep going, right? So if you think about people who they know they're not going to have that huge mansion on the hill, they know they're not going to live on the coast of Malibu or any of these kind of things, but they still get up, they still go to work every day, they still provide for their families. That's a lot of families in America, right? Are these ritualists. And so Merton would say though too, and again, to me this is my favorite category, are the innovators, really interesting groups. So these are people who want the nice things, right? But either they're not interested in going about it the institutionalized way, or they're just, this is the thing where you have to drill down a little deeper, they lack legitimate opportunities for those opportunities, right? So for instance, you want to get a good job. What happens if you go to a failing school in a poor neighborhood that, is basically just warehousing students instead of really teaching them, not providing AP classes, not providing any college prep or, any sort of, anything beyond kind of daycare during the day. And, in, again, underfunded programs with, few resources, so that those things are really, narrowly distributed across students, it makes sense that a lot of people aren't going to see college as something that's successful for them because, they don't really know anyone who in their direct lives have money or are successful because they went to college. Some of the people that they might come in contact with that do have money or are more powerful, have more status, have more money and wealth, are people who are somehow related to the underground economy. You look at areas that, because of redlining and white flight and all this other stuff that we'll talk about later, are these communities that are just locked in endemic poverty by design, right? And in these situations, there's very few legitimate opportunities for good jobs, especially for high-paying jobs. You might be able to get a minimum wage job, but that's not going to be able to support you and your family, right? And so innovation becomes trying to find a way to still get those goals, but do it a different way. So sometimes that means turning to the underground economy, right? Such as if you get your minimum wage job, which again is difficult to get when there's very few of them available, and then that job doesn't pay your rent, but drug dealing would basically make as much money as you'd make in a week, in an hour, then it becomes kind of like a straight up cost benefit analysis ratio there, right? Like think about this from a law enforcement perspective. You're basically, because of the economic structural conditions, you're basically pushing people into the underground economy, whether it's drugs, whether it's, gambling, prostitution, guns, any of these other kind of like underground illicit economies. These are the economies that don't ask for letters of recommendation. They don't need a GPA. You don't have to have, you're not going to like the drug dealer's going to call your last 3 drug dealers you worked for and be like, hey, was he good at selling drugs? They don't do that. And if you're in a community where there's so few opportunities, you have to understand that this is basically like again, it's just kind of rational that people would end up choosing that innovation, that selling drugs, because it's just going to get them way closer to the goals of society than, that ritualism that's really going to get them stuck in, basically the same economic condition they're already in. So what's interesting about this is it really shows us that from a structural perspective, at least according to functionalists, if we had a way to, bring businesses back to some of these formerly red line communities. We'll talk about this later, but deindustrialization meant that all the factory jobs that used to pay decent money to people moved to other countries so that those corporations could make a lot more money by paying people a lot less. We'll talk about that later. But all that did was leave a huge deficit of jobs. They didn't replace those jobs. The only things that were replaced with was the underground economy. So if you're a police officer and you're like tasked to work in this hotspot area of high crime, or like where there's a lot of this underground economy going on, it would benefit you the most if there was more funding and investment in education, if there was more funding and investment in actual well-paid jobs within these communities, because people are going to pick the thing that actually gets them to that success, and it's going to have this kind of conformist effect, right? You give people the opportunity to get through school, to get a high-paying job. Guess what? They're not going to mess around with the underground economy in the same way. It doesn't have the same lure to it, right? So just side note, these are why we talk about structural changes that are needed. That, we can put 1 billion cops on the street, but if we don't deal with the underlying economic issues that cause people to be driven into the underground economy, it's never going to stop, right? Side notes. Anyway, okay, I'll get back to it. I apologize. Retreatism, again, a little bit oversold, but basically like people who aren't interested or invested in the goals or in the means in a day-to-day routine. So like, let's say you are Ted Kaczynski and you move to a shack in the woods and you decide to start mailing bombs to people, right? Okay, that's a terrible example actually. But I mean, minus the bombs, right? You're just living up in the hills somewhere, being a hermit. That would be retreatism. But, basically kind of withdrawing from society in some way. So sometimes people say this about homeless communities, like, oh, they're, they're rejecting the goals and the means of society. But that really assumes that the majority of homeless people are there because they want to be homeless or because they chose to be homeless, and not the structural factors we'll talk about later that lead certain communities to be more likely to end up homeless, or certain groups like, such as a lot of veterans end up, with kind of untreated mental health issues, end up homeless, or things like this, where when we know more about the patterns that lead to these issues, we can do a better job of trying to provide resources to eliminate those issues. And then rebels are the most interesting one of all. They create different goals and they create different means. So these are people that, okay, for me, my favorite example of this are, if you've ever seen any of those like HGTV shows that are like tiny homes, where the people go into a house and it's like 20 square foot kitchen and they're like, I don't know, I think it's too big. And you're like, it's not. But anyway, or those people that like buy a school bus and renovate it and then like live in a school bus. Kind of fascinating, because think of it this way. Their new goals of society, instead of the goals being you work, you go to school, you work endlessly to get a house that you just fill with a bunch of shit that you don't need, and just keep filling every room with every single thing, and you buy all this crap that you never actually have time to spend any time with, because you now have to work 3-4 jobs just to pay for all that crap that you don't need to fill a big ass empty house full of this crap. They reject that societal goal, and they create a goal of just being debt free, being able to travel. So if you put 25 grand into a school bus, you're done. And so a lot of these people, they can then either live off the grid, have renewable sources, things like that, or just travel around, stay at like campsites, and be able to work really minimally and still be able to pay their bills versus, having to basically leverage their entire futures to pay for all the crap that they're accumulating. So it's kind of interesting. They have new goals and new means through which to do this. Or even the people that live like far off the grid and they have their own, solar, wind, or, other systems to kind of maintain their existence. That could be another example of that too. Okay, moving on to social disorganization theory. This theory argues that a person is not born a criminal, but they become one over time. So it's a theory developed at the Chicago School of Sociology and was related to other ecological theories at the time, like back in the day, almost 100 years ago. And the theory links crime rates to neighborhood ecological characteristics. So basically, where you live affects whether or not you commit crime, is their idea. So that a person's location is a substantial factor in shaping the likelihood that they'll become involved in illegal activities. So if crime and violence are normal in your neighborhood, that can influence people who live there, especially youth, who may seek out other youth who are delinquent. And so building on this, Sean McKay's cultural relevance theory argues that conforming to cultural norms of the lower class can cause crime, which again is very victim blamey, because it's just kind of assuming a social class bias there, right? Are we pretending like rich people don't commit crimes? Like they didn't destroy the entire world's economy back in 2008 and not go to jail for it? Anyway, but then we have Samson and Groves, who they found in their research that poverty, ethnic diversity, and family disruption are all correlated with social disorganization. So meaning if you're in a neighborhood with high rates of social disorganization, that's going to be associated with higher rates of crime or delinquency. And again, they're looking at this stuff a long time ago, and some of their assumptions are a little bit meh. So what's interesting is it builds on this Park and Burgess's concentric zone model, which kind of all of these are what they call ecological theories, basically trying to apply ecological theories to humans. Like if you've ever heard of the idea of an invasive species, right? That's kind of the idea they're talking about here. So they're saying here, as cities themselves grow or move outward from the center outward, they create different zones, and which zone you're in is going to affect how much kind of deviance or illegal activity would happen within that area. So they're basically saying that the city itself, depending on where you are in it, and they basically controlled this for age, for race, for social class, things like that, just saying like where you are in these zones is really going to affect the kind of level of crime that you might experience as a victim of crime, or the likelihood of you committing the crimes. Okay, that was a lot. Okay, let's move on to conflict theory. So they look at social and economic factors as causes of crimes and deviance, and they don't see deviance as a positive function of society like functionalists do. They see deviance as evidence of social inequality. So they challenge social disorganization theory and cultural deviance theory, arguing that both of them ignore racial and socioeconomic issues and really oversimplify some of the social trends that they were looking at. So Marx first talks about an unequal system. So Marx was interested in power differences between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Remember, the owners are the bourgeoisie and the laborers are the proletariat. So Marx believed the bourgeoisie centralized their power and influence through the government. So the rich people basically get to create laws and other authority agencies to maintain and expand their power in society. Building on this is C. Wright Mill's concept of the power elite. These are the people at the top of society with the most power to make the decisions that affect all of our lives. So they're like that. Right down here, I got this kind of graphic of these different ideas, like where they overlap, right? So you have people that are at the top of the executives, like CEOs, right? Company presidents, major shareholders, these kind of people. You have the highest politicians, political elite, so the senior leadership and elected officials. You have the highest military leaders as well. And all of these people, like right in this nexus here in the middle, they all have the power to make the impactful decisions that we all have to then live with. So due to this concentration of power and decision making, the rules of society are often stacked in favor of a privileged few who manipulate the rules to stay on top. So they get to determine what's criminal and what's not. Right? Like there's this example I have for that one, like if you think about the Epstein case, not the fact, that he mysteriously died in jail and blah, blah, blah. But before that, the time when he did get caught for sex trafficking dozens of minors, he was given one of the most lenient sentences that's ever happened for such a crime, right? Basically, he had a sentence that was extremely reduced. I believe it was 18 months, and he only had to stay in jail at night. He got to go home during the day, which is typically not how jail works, right? That's typically not. But if you're a billionaire and you also had very high-powered, influential figures such as Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, Prince Andrew, flying on your jet or going to his private island nicknamed Pedophile Island. I mean, you can't make this shit up, right? So anyway, Jeffrey Epstein got one of the best legal deals that anyone's ever seen. One of the charges that he had against him should have just itself been like 15 plus years. When you're trafficking minors for sex across state lines, it's a federal crime. But anyway, he got a total sweetheart deal. And then when all that stuff went down more recently, when he got caught and then incarcerated and then ended up hung in his jail cell, that's when people started saying, hey, why did he get such a lenient sentence last time? And, trying to look into the kind of power and influence that might have affected his, criminal sentencing. When any of us, if we would have done even one of those multiple crimes, we would be in jail for pretty much the rest of our lives. Okay, so that kind of leads very well into crime and social class. So basically, conflict theorists argue that crimes that are committed by powerful people or the wealthy remain underpunished and very costly to society. So Bernie Madoff ran a Ponzi scheme that cost $50 billion, but he was put in jail because his victims were famous, like Steven Spielberg and many other rich people you've heard of. So an imbalance there is an imbalance in our system when it comes to social class power that we can see within the criminal justice system itself. Like, why do you wear a suit to court? Right? How do you pay for a lawyer? Right? These things, if you are rich, you can pay for the best lawyer that'll do the best job. If you're poor, you end up with a public defender. If you're lucky, some states don't even have very low threshold. The idea that how you're dressed in court, how you're signaling your social class affects how you're interpreted by the judge. What social class is the judge? What social class is the jury? I mean, that's a pretty interesting one as well we could go into. But anyway, we don't have time. So the idea is that we know that you dress up nice in court to look like you're richer than you are, so that you look less culpable, right? Because we have a bias in society that assumes that poor people are just more criminal. And then, of course, how good your lawyer is also comes down to how much you can pay. Another example of how crime and social class would work would be the 100-to-1 rule. Right, I have a little figure on here about that. Basically, that this was a law that was put into place that was a criminal sentencing difference between crack and powder cocaine, which we'll talk about the war on drugs later, but this is really about who is associated with which drug. So when you think about crack cocaine, at least the public perception, of course, when you actually look at like usage rates, white people outuse most communities of color on pretty much every drug, but anyway, there was an assumption that people that were using crack cocaine were Black and brown communities, especially impoverished communities, versus our conception of who uses powder cocaine is like Wall Street people and, rich white people, right? So the idea was when they created this law, the criminal sentencing here, they basically said if you had 5 grams of crack cocaine, right, basically enough to fit in a small, baggie in your pocket, right, that equals 500 grams of powder cocaine, which is like a suitcase full of cocaine. And that has the same 5-year mandatory minimum sentence. Right? And really, what is the difference between crack cocaine and powder cocaine? It's really just like heat and baking soda. So the real difference there, though, coming from a conflict theory perspective, would be who's associated with using each drug, right? You basically make it really less lenient. Like you have to have like a suitcase full of drugs, basically, as an old white guy to get arrested and go to jail for 5 years, versus someone that has a small amount of possession in their pocket. They're going to go away for 5 years. So this kind of really shows this was an issue within, the war on drugs, which we'll talk about later. But that's one example. They did modify the law during the Obama administration. So now it's 18-1. So you can have like 18 grams versus 1. That's still not 1-to-1. But I will give it to them that 18-1 is better than 100-1. Slightly. It's still unequal. Okay, symbolic interactionism looks at how society or social groups come to view behavior as deviant or as normal or conventional. So labeling theory explores the idea of how we label activities and people as deviant. All of us violate norms from time to time, but few of us consider ourselves deviant. Those who do consider ourselves deviant have often been labeled as deviant by society and have gradually come to believe it themselves. So what's considered deviant is not determined by behaviors themselves or people that commit them, but really the reactions of others to that behavior. That's what symbolic interaction says. Because remember, they say that we make meanings through interactions. So what's considered deviant changes over time, and again, can vary significantly across cultures. So then moving to Lamert's primary and secondary deviance. Primary deviance is violation of norms that does not result in any long-term effect on the individual's self-image or interactions with others. So you're speeding on the freeway, you get a ticket, but you don't consider yourself like a bad person for getting a ticket, right? Versus secondary deviance occurs when a person's self-concept and behaviors begin to change after their actions are labeled as deviant. So this is kind of like the idea that if you were told your entire life, you're a bad kid, you're bad, you're deviant, you're, negative, etc., you start to believe it. Just in the same way that, like, if your mom says you're so handsome, you're the most handsome boy, then you're like, well, I'm very handsome, right? Or someone says, hey, you're really great at taking tests over and over and over, and then you're like, I'm great at taking tests, right? The idea of labeling is that the more you hear something, the more you start to internalize that idea. So what happens with secondary deviance is once your self-concept is affected, meaning your ego can only protect you for so long, where you're like, I'm not bad. And then eventually you're like, you know what, I am bad. I'll show you how bad I am. And you actually lean into a deviant identity. So in a lot of ways, especially in the school system, we criminalize, we make deviant a lot of children that are acting out without actually sitting the kid down and saying, what's going on with you? Why are you acting out? And understanding that sometimes when children act out, it's because they're going through something. They're experiencing pain in some way. Young people have a very difficult time articulating the issues that they're dealing with, so they might act out deviantly, right? And if people are trained for this that work with children or, law enforcement, probation, parole people, all those kind of people that understand, hey, the more we say, hey, you're bad, like those scared straight things where you like yell stuff at kids, it just doesn't work. Right? It actually can make people lean into a deviant identity and push them farther away. And the idea of the basic social contract is we follow laws in society when they feel fair to us. And the more that you make someone kind of distance from society, there's less of a reason for them to follow the rules, right? But if you say, hey, you know what? You made a mistake. You learned from the mistake. We'll bring you back into the fold. You're still accepted in society. Then people have a vested interest in actually reforming their behavior. But if you tell them, hey, you're a lost cause, you're not worth reforming, there's no point anymore, right? You might as well be bad. Okay, moving into Sutherland's Differential Association theory. Here's another one I'm sure you've heard of in some aspect or another. Basically, Sutherland wanted to understand how deviant behavior develops among different groups of people. So deferential association theory suggests that individuals learn deviant behavior from those who are close to them, and those people provide models and opportunities for deviance. So I'm sure you've heard this idea of you're hanging out with the wrong crowd, right? If you're hanging out with folks that normalize drinking, drugs, smoking, committing crimes, things like that, then those behaviors then just become more normal for you, right? The people who are providing those models or opportunities for deviance, kind of lead you to some of that deviance. So it also explains why crime is multi-generational. Longitudinal research from the 1960s found that the best predictor of antisocial or criminal behavior was whether someone's parents had been convicted of a crime, right? Like if your parents have gone to jail, if a lot of your family members have gone to jail, it might just be somewhat normalized, especially if you're in a community that's hyper-policed, right? But in the same way, if you grow up in a situation where your parents are, drug addicts, and you're raised in a situation where you see that behavior normalized, right? It might be more likely that you don't see it as deviant as someone who didn't have that experience. Okay, moving on to Travis Hershey's control theory. Control theory argues that social control is directly affected by the strengths of our social bonds. So deviance results from feeling disconnected with society. So individuals who believe they're part of society will not commit as many crimes against it. So he has these different levels of control theory that are important to whether or not people become deviant. So the first is attachment, right? Our connection to others. When we're closely attached, we care about others' opinions of us. So people will conform to society's norms to gain approval from their family, their friends, their partners, people that they want that attachment to. Commitment is investment that we make in the community, right? So the more that you're invested in, like, let's say school, you're, have like a really good job that you're really invested in, things like that, that's going to keep you away from doing things that would risk those connections. Involvement is participation in socially legitimate activities that make it so a person is less likely to become deviant. So some of these ones, they'll give examples of like institutions like being more involved in school, being more involved in maybe a religious community, or even like a sports community or something like that. Like let's say because you have to study for this particular mathlete event, or because you're on the soccer team and you're having a big match the next day, you're less likely to go out drinking that whole night before or something like that, right? Because you have something to lose that you don't want to lose. So your involvement within those activities or those socially legitimate activities can keep you away from the socially illegitimate activities. And then belief is just agreement on common values in society. So do you feel like the laws are just? Do you feel like they reflect you? This is a big one when it comes to kind of hotspot policing and poor communities, is that if people feel like, policies like stop and frisk or things like that have really engendered a lot of resentment within many communities, because if you feel like police are just there to stop and harass you and detain you and not actually help you, like if you call the police and it takes them forever to show up, but if you're just walking down the street and someone's stopping and harassing you like every day you walk down the street, obviously your agreement towards the common values of society is going to be pretty twisted, because you're going to be like, well, the common value doesn't reflect how I feel, right? So in a lot of ways, we have to really think back to these things and see how, the more equity, the more fairness we can have in the way that we actually, enforce laws, can have a huge impact on people's connection or belief to those things being just and the fact that they should be followed. Okay, moving on to crime. So crime is a behavior that violates official law and is punishable through formal sanctions. So walking backwards can be deviant, right? Because that's weird. But driving drunk is a crime, right? It's something that's codified into law. Like other forms of deviance, there is some ambiguity that concerns what constitutes a crime or whether all crimes are actually bad, like the Rosa Parks example. Or like MLK gave this interview in the Jim Crow era that was really impactful that said something like, this guy was like, well, you're breaking the law, when you do these, protests and sit-ins and this and that. And he said, yeah, but what kind of law is that? Right? And that's kind of getting to that point. So all societies have informal and formal ways of maintaining social control. Like societies mostly have, like ours has legal codes, ways that we put social control into law. And then, the textbook defines the laws themselves as rules adopted and enforced by political authorities. So those who violate the rules receive negative formal sanctions. Different types of crimes. There's violent crimes, or as they're often called, crimes against persons. So they're based on the use of force or the threat of force, such as rape, murder, armed robbery, things like that. Nonviolent crimes are often what we call property crimes, or destruction of or theft of property. But these crimes don't use force, so they could be car theft or vandalism, things like that. So when we think of crime, though, we often think of street crime, or offenses committed by ordinary people in public spaces. This is largely due to media bias, and the fact that power affects our perceptions of crime and criminals. Often overlooked is corporate crime, or white-collar crime, which is crimes committed by white-collar workers in a business environment. This can include embezzling, insider trading, identity theft, and financially these crimes are far more devastating than street crimes, but they're largely ignored by the media. There's actually, when I was going through journalism school, there's actually this phrase that's used a lot within the media that I think really alludes to this, called, if it bleeds, it leads. Meaning, if something is particularly tragic or bloody, that's what's going to be the story leading the newscast that night. If it bleeds, it leads. So we focus on the armed robberies, we focus on the drive-by shootings, we focus on the senseless killings that happen, but we don't really focus on, CEOs making selfish decisions that then cause, hundreds of thousands of people to lose their jobs, lose their pensions, the kind of finagling that happened with interest rates and all sorts of other backhanded dealing, especially when it came to the, basically selling people mortgages that they couldn't afford and then betting against them on the stock market that they would fail, and then making millions of dollars in the process of that, and actually destroying the entire world's economy. Pretty devastating, right? But that is a very difficult story to tell, and it's often ignored by the media because it doesn't have the kind of right villain, right? We think of white rich people as kind of like the apex of society. So all those social hierarchies that we have say so. So we don't think of them as criminal or deviant as much, even when they destroy the world's economy, right? We have this bias in us, and that, of course, the media is owned by those same rich white people, not the exact same, but are influenced by a lot of the same corporations, are reliant on advertising dollars from a lot of these same people and same actors. So they're not really going to tell that story. It's a lot easier to point to the kid on the street corner that, pulled out a knife and took $20 out of someone's pocket as the real problem with society, and just completely ignore the people that are at the top and manipulate in so many ways all of our lives when we have to bail out these systems. Like, think about the horrible wildfires that happen in California. It happens, right? There are, especially climate change related, which we'll talk about later, issues as to why there are more frequent fires. But in recent years, so many of the most devastating fires have really come from the fact that PG&E and other companies like it have not done the infrastructure work on their, systems. So they could bury those wires in the ground, and then when a big wind pops up, like the Santa Ana winds do, like all the damn time, it wouldn't knock over any sort of towers that would then spark fires and cause some of the hugest, or the largest fires in California history have happened in the last couple of years, and they've been often sparked because of inaction from these particular companies. So they make millions of dollars every year taking people's money, but they don't take any of that money that they're making in profits and put it back into investing within those systems so that they can reduce the wildfire risks and save people's lives. So part of that infrastructure bill that was passed by the Biden administration addresses that by giving some of these corporations money, just straight up giving them grants to do some of these projects that they should have been doing anyway, that they actually should somehow be legally mandated to do for the safety and protection of everyone else in the state. But again, corporate interests are often, again, not examined, so we don't even realize how much of a devastation they have, right? Or for instance, a couple oil spills that happened recently off the coast of California. These companies, they just are asked to pay a couple $1 million and then they're done. And that doesn't really solve the problems that undercut that. So oftentimes we only hear about the street crimes. We don't hear about the corporate crimes. And we don't realize just how much detriment those have to our lives, which is, pretty substantial. Okay, moving on, because I'll just keep going. I promise you, take my crim class, we'll get all into it. Victimless crime are activities that are against the law but do not result in injury to anyone other than the person who engages in them. So like, underage drinking, drug use, prostitution, gambling, stuff like that, right? Though some would argue from a legal perspective there is no such thing as a victimless crime, because the victim's society, but whatever. We typically consider them victimless crimes. And then hate crimes are attacks based on a person's race, religion, or other characteristics, such as their gender identity, sexual orientation, disability status, immigration status, or many others. So we saw a huge uptick in hate crimes against Asian Americans during the pandemic because people are really, really racist and dumb, and somehow their misconception of the idea that somehow China engineered this virus on purpose, which is a whole nother, put that to the side, that's something we could totally take apart, that argument. But then how the hell does that equate to someone's walking down the street in Los Angeles and you pull over your car and you just beat the crap out of them because they look like they might be Asian? How the hell did they have anything to do with any, even if that Chinese stuff was true, how does this individual have anything to do with that? But that's really the problem, right? Is especially when it comes to things like racism, people aren't logical. You can't logic racism because they're already being incredibly illogical just to think that crap in the first place. So hate crimes, the idea is we add more penalty to it because the hate crime itself is not just targeted at the individual. It's targeted at the community. And sometimes these things are like, putting up swastikas in a Jewish cemetery or, like going through and destroying mosques and things like this. Sometimes it's not even individuals themselves that are harmed, but actually like buildings or community centers or things that are supposed to, service certain communities. And that can be another way to target them as well. So the idea is a hate crime is an attack against that person, but it's really also an attack against that entire group. And the thing is too, it's not even necessarily based on a person's real identities. It's based on a perception of their identities, right? So if I'm heterosexual and I'm holding my friend's hand, who is another heterosexual woman, and someone interprets that we are homosexual and attacks us, that's still considered a hate crime, right? Because they're doing those things motivated by prejudice against a particular group. So whether or not you're actually a member of that group is irrelevant. It's all about the perceptions, right? Okay, stop letting me tangent. Okay, back to crime statistics. So what we know about crime comes from statistics like the FBI's Uniform Crime Report, the UCR, which tracks the number of certain crimes nationally. But due to the way things are cataloged by local police mistakes, and also the fact that there's, for instance, a report came out in, I think it was 2021, talking about how systematically police were underreporting officer-involved shootings to the UCR so that the data was flawed. And as a researcher and someone who teaches criminal justice research methods at Cal State Fullerton, it bothers me. It gets me fired up, because how are we supposed to understand what's going on with crimes in society if we don't have the right data? Also, the UCR has a lot of limitations when it comes to only certain crimes are reported, and often they always go off of whatever the top crime was. So let's say I stalked you, I lit your house on fire, and I killed you. Oftentimes the way it would be entered into the UCR would be murder, and not murder, arson, and stalking, right? So that's a limitation as well. So, but there's also, no matter how many crimes are reported, there's also a lot of crime that goes unreported. So a limitation of the UCR is it's all obviously only reported crimes. There's this thing called the dark figure or the dark matter of crime, which is basically the idea that there's a lot of crimes that just aren't solved. So we don't really know, right, what's going on with that. So we try to fill in that gap in data by turning to self-reports, such as the National Crime Victimization Report, the NCVR, which is distributed to households and asks people if they're a victim of a crime. So it is different because it's basically saying, hey, in the last 6 months, have you been a victim of any of these particular crimes? And the idea is that people will be more likely to answer this survey, especially if they're from a community where they either didn't want to report for any particular reason because of their identity, such as, immigration status or something like that, or if it's a crime that was kind of personal. So for instance, rape is one of the most underreported crimes in America. And when you look at the NCVR versus the actual official crime statistics, you see a huge gap. And, the idea is that because a lot of people aren't reporting these things to law enforcement because they don't want to be re-victimized by going through trial, or maybe they dated this person and it's complicated to try to go through the legal apparatus. Or, unfortunately, in the case when it comes to a lot of situations that happen in college, sometimes colleges themselves try to use their own internal processes for this to keep students from going to law enforcement outside of campus, and therefore squashing these things from the inside. It's a whole nother thing. But anyway, another limitation of the NCVR is who receives it, meaning it only is mailed out to households. What if you don't live in a house, right? What if you're homeless, or what if you're a business owner and you have a lot of crimes that are happening, but you hadn't officially reported them because maybe it was like your bike was stolen and it felt minor to you, so you don't report it, right? We basically want to fill in those gaps of data to understand what crime rates are actually happening, so that we can, better utilize the resources that we have and provide better services. So when it comes to public perceptions of crime, while the UCR and NCVR don't account for all crime, we can learn some general patterns from the data we have. For instance, violent crimes have been dropping since the 90s, yet public perception, people think that crime is worse than ever, but it's not. And the inaccurate perception of crime is heightened by news coverage, by popular crime shows like CSI, Criminal Minds, Law and Order. I love that crap. Boom, 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 right? But it puts that stuff in our minds. And again, the news coverage every night is a huge factor in our false perceptions. It's really interesting. Take my crime class, we'll talk about how it has a lot to do with demographics, those larger crime rates. Anyway, so moving on to the actual criminal justice system a little bit. Criminal justice system is an organization that exists to enforce the legal code. So the system's made up of many parts and players. First, you have the police, which are the civil force in charge of enforcing laws and public order. And this happens at a federal, state, or community level. And there's also federal law enforcement officers like the FBI, the ATF, Department of Homeland Security, and others. So a large social problem in our current system is the prevalence of police brutality. I'm sure you've heard of, many high-profile cases that were brought to public attention because of the Black Lives Matter movement, such as, Philando Castile, Eric Gardner, George Floyd, so many others. And, the real argument that these rights movements are trying to make is that it's not just a few bad apples. It's the way in which policing exists. It's the lack of accountability. It's the fact that so many people like the officer Derek Chauvin, who kneeled on the neck of George Floyd for over 9 minutes until he died, had several previous complaints against him, and yet was still out on the streets. So it's a matter of fact that, the police unions themselves, etc., are often I don't know how to get into this without getting into it too deeply. Okay, so let me give you a quick example, something we talk about in my criminal justice class. So recently, I think it was 2021, there was a study put out that found that there were over 15 distinct gangs within the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, meaning these small groups of sheriffs who would, for instance, one of the groups, they would get together after a civilian was shot and celebrate. If they were a person of color, they would get, related tattoos. They would, all sorts of really shady, underhanded stuff. And that's terrible. The idea that, officers who are entrusted to protect the law would actually be violating the law and actually acting as a criminal organization themselves is, terrifying, right? But aside from that, what's even more terrifying in my view is the fact that the sheriff's department and the sheriff's union basically paid off people in a lot of cases to hide the fact that this was happening. They didn't want people to know that there was over a dozen gangs operating within the sheriff's department. So they, made people sign non-disclosure agreements to try and get past that so people wouldn't know. And they did know, and there was like an over 80-page report that was put out in 2021 detailing some of these issues, which I don't have time to get into here. But that's kind of one of those things where when people talk about reforming the police, it's not super radical to say, hey, let's make sure that the people who are entrusted to uphold the law are doing so, are not themselves engaging in criminal behaviors, and are creating an environment that is more akin to what we call community-oriented policing, where people in the community feel connected to law enforcement, they feel that law enforcement's there to protect them, and therefore they're more likely to cooperate when law enforcement needs their help. So for instance, if I'm a cop in an area that's underserved and harassed and often hotspot policed, and I, don't have the hearts and minds of the community, obviously, then when I need their help to identify a suspect, that's not going to happen. But if I am part of the community, they know me, they get to know me and see me around, and I'm able to develop relationships, then you can talk to stakeholders in the community that can help you really solve these things. It's a win-win for law enforcement and for communities. But more and more we have what's called military-style policing, and a large part of this comes from the war on drugs. So I'll try not to get into that too much in this lecture. Okay, courts. Just stop me at some point. Okay, courts. So once a suspect's been charged with something, right, their case goes to court, and a court is the system that has the authority to make decisions based on law. So the U.S. judicial system is divided into federal courts and state courts. Judges who preside over federal courts are selected by the president with the consent of Congress, which is a whole nother problem. State courts, don't let me get into that. State courts are generally divided into trial courts, appellate courts, and state supreme courts. Unlike on TV, most cases are decided by a judge without a jury present, such as non-criminal cases like, I don't know if you've ever had to go to traffic court, right? Or like things like small claims court. So criminal cases are heard by trial courts with general jurisdictions, and this is when juries happen. Juries are there to determine the guilt, and it's up to the judge to really determine the penalty, though in some states the jury may also decide the penalty. So unless a defendant is found not guilty, any member of the prosecution or defense can appeal the case to a higher court. Then it goes to the appellate court, then the Supreme Court. So, and then of course, if it goes past the state Supreme Court, it goes to the actual Supreme Court. But anyway, that's a whole other thing you don't need to know. So the correction system, known as the prison system, is charged with supervising individuals who've been arrested, convicted, and sentenced for a criminal offense. The U.S. incarceration rate has grown considerably over the last 50 years, and this is largely the result of the war on drugs. Okay, so war on drugs in a nutshell. Basically, Nixon started this thing called the war on drugs. And at the time, the way that it was organized was the funding was split between prevention, enforcement, and treatment, right? So about a third for each. And what's interesting is when he started the war on drugs, that wasn't really something that either police wanted, because they were like, we need more resources to fight violent crimes, and a lot of drug crimes are nonviolent or just possession crimes. And it really wasn't part of the, politically what people were interested in as constituents. So what's interesting is John Ehrlichman, the assistant to the president, to President Nixon for domestic affairs, he admitted in an interview, and you can actually listen to this quote. And again, I'm going to read you the quote, but you can actually hear his voice saying it. It's wild. It's one of those quotes where you're like, you're being recorded, right, bro? But anyway, he said, quote, "Do you want to know what this, in parentheses, war on drugs, do you want to know what this war on drugs was really about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying?" Again, this is a quote from John Ehrlichman. "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to either be against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." And again, you can hear his own voice say this. This is John Ehrlichman, the assistant to the president for domestic affairs. Anyway, that's kind of my learning about the war on drugs in a nutshell. There was some motivations behind it that were really about targeting people, and actually fascinating history of which drugs are criminalized is actually often connected to targeting certain communities. Like opium first became illegal in California to target Chinese immigrants. Though at the time, the majority of the other people using opium were like little old ladies. So anyway, take my crim class. We'll talk about it for like the entire class. Anyway, so like I said, Nixon, when he started the war on drugs for his nefarious purposes, the funding was split between prevention, enforcement, and treatment, right? So there was this idea of you got to prevent people from getting addicted in the first place, and we have to have some compassion for people who are addicted to drugs to help them with treatment. But this changes under Reagan in 1980. Initially, again, police were not behind this political move, but they were co-opted eventually through more and more funding and the advent of what's called civil assets forfeiture, right? So civil assets forfeiture, the goal is to go after kingpins and stop the money that they have, like freezing the assets of kingpins. The idea being that if you're a drug lord, the whole reason you do it is money, right? And that would stop your criminal organization. But how it's actually used, civil assets forfeiture, every day, is on poor people in mass across the U.S. Still to this day, cops get to keep a percentage of the money they seize. So I'm going to show you a map real quick that really demonstrates this, that it's different depending on your state. Okay, so here's one of the maps. Just ignore all the stupid ads that keep popping up. It's really bothering me. But anyway, this one is looking at, does your state require a criminal conviction for police to take and keep your property? So in most states, civil assets forfeiture laws allow police to take and keep your property without a criminal conviction. Only a few states limit most or all civil forfeiture cases. So here in California, we're one of the very rare states that requires a criminal conviction, meaning if I say, hey, you're drug trafficking, right? And I take your car, you actually have to be convicted of it. In some places, you only have to be charged. In other places, you have to be not even charged, but suspected, right? So you see that there's different levels depending on this. Let's say closer to us, Arizona. This one, you would basically just say, are you suspected of committing a drug crime? Then they can take your stuff, right? And then going down here, let's see, there's another one. How much of the property they take do they actually get to keep? Now, this is an interesting one as well, right? So California, again, a little bit better with this stuff. So the percentage is actually 65%, right? But in some states, it's 100%, right? Meaning, you know, a couple states here like North Dakota, a few of these ones, they're pretty smart, it's 0, right? Now, why would you want it to be 0 instead of 100%? Because if you get to keep 100%, this part of civil assets forfeiture creates a conflict of interest, right? And has been correlated in criminal justice research with an increase in planting of drugs on innocent civilians. So like we saw, in many states, you don't even have to be convicted or sentenced or charged. And this challenges the protections outlined by the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, that illegal search and seizure part of the Constitution. And so what's interesting about that, why did the founders care so much about illegal search and seizure? Well, because British troops would harass them, the founders, right? And they would even force them to house soldiers in their home. Could you imagine that? Like an army from another country shows up and they come to your house and they're like, you have to let me live in your bedroom. And you're like, what? Right? So it was important to the founders that we had civil protections from harassment and searches because they understood how uncool that was and the power dynamics involved. So the war on drugs has done a lot of stuff, but another thing it's done is really change the power of prosecutors, who are the most powerful position in the criminal justice system. They can choose to charge someone or not charge someone without oversight. So for the Epstein example I gave you earlier, right, having the kind of authority to do that, or like the Ahmaud Arbery case, where Ahmaud Arbery was murdered. Basically, he was taking a jog through his neighborhood, and one was a former police officer, but him and his son and another friend basically started chasing him. The one man videotaped it, and the other man, shot him dead. And basically, the prosecutor was a friend of the former police officer man who killed Ahmaud Arbery. So she decided not to charge him. And it wasn't until the video was released that there was actually someone saying, okay, maybe we should charge this guy with murder. You have this kind of incident, though, in society where we see lawyers arguing in court on many TV shows, trying to convince a jury about the innocence or guilt of a defendant. But in reality, the overwhelming majority of cases are handled through plea bargains, which has escalated under the war on drugs due to mandatory minimum sentences. So brief explanation there. Mandatory minimums are like if you have, let's say, a gun and X amount of marijuana, mandatory minimum 15 years, things like that. Like you trigger certain things by having certain things on you, you're going to jail for X amount of time. So if prosecutors want to win cases, what they do is they do. Fun fact, prosecutors do want to win cases because it makes their career better. So when it comes to a plea bargain, that's considered winning a case. So what they'll do is they'll overcharge or overload people, meaning let's say you have possession of a drug in your pocket, but you also have like groceries in your back seat, and in there are like some grocery bags, right? Sandwich bags. So they're like, hey, you had drugs and bags. We're going to charge you with intent to distribute. That's going to be a federal mandatory minimum. We even see this on the TV shows, right? Where they threaten people with longer charges or federal charges. So they plead out to lesser sentences without risking, because you don't know how the courtroom's going to go or how the jury's going to go. And depending on, if you don't have a good attorney, then the likelihood of winning your case can be low. So even in cases where people are innocent, sometimes they basically take the plea bargain because that will get them out of jail. So we hear that everyone gets a lawyer, but that's not always the case either. It depends on the kind of court they're in, and it depends on the kind of money a person has, right? For example, as of 2021 in Wisconsin, if you made more than $16,000 a year, you don't qualify for a public defender. And remember, lawyers get paid $100 to $400 an hour depending on their prestige. Rich lawyers make, thousands. So if you make $300 a week, which is what $16,000 a year is, then you would have to basically pay for 3 hours with your lawyer, and then that's all you could pay for your entire week, right? So you go broke so fast and you wouldn't qualify for a public defender. So there's a lot of weird ways that we get around that, and states have different laws that have very low thresholds for some of these. Also, the group of people that's the least likely to have representation at all are children, who are often seen without representation in family courts or immigration courts. So what we see on TV is not a reflection of how the system actually works, but that's what people are the most familiar with. And when it comes to prisons, the US has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. So prison's different from jail. Jail is temporary confinement, usually while an individual awaits trial or parole. Prisons are facilities built for individuals serving sentences of more than a year. So think of it like jails are small, prisons are big, and jails are local, and prisons are more run by state and federal government. So parole refers to temporary release from prison or jail that requires supervision and the consent of officials. And parole is different from probation. Probation is supervised time that's used as an alternative to going to prison, while parole is, basically being temporary release from prison to be under the supervision of a parole officer outside of jail. And the idea there is that if you have people, they're still under corrective control, but they're not in prison, it's a way to deal with overcrowding in prisons, which again is another byproduct of the war on drugs. Take my crim class, we'll talk all about it, but it's hard to cram all of this information into one teeny tiny lecture when you're a weirdo like me that teaches multiple criminal justice classes. So I tried my best.